I chain smoke and I say fuck a lot. But I accept myself for the way I am. I accept you too. Viewer discretion advised. Around a week or two ago, I was working and listening to YouTube in the background as I worked, like I do sometimes. After the video I was listening to finished, another video started, and it was Tucker Carlson. I might usually change that, but it was a topic that I was interested in. So I kept listening, and it made me want to read Bill Barr's book, which was kind of torturous. George H.W. Bush ass-kissing ex-CIA employee Bill Barr. But there were some significant things.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This video is sponsored by you, the viewer. I've had a sponsor before. I didn't like it, so I'm not sponsored, nor am I monetized anywhere. So anything I do make comes from you. So if you like what I do and you want to support the cause, you can shoot me a tip or support to my PayPal, Venmo, Cash App below. Or you can join my Patreon or check out my merch store.
On Saturday morning, August 10th, 2019, Attorney General William Barr was working in his home office when his chief of staff called to say that Jeffrey Epstein had just been found dead in his cell in New York City.
On the morning of Saturday, August 10, 2019, I was working in my home study when I got a call from Brian Rabbit. "Boss," he said, "we have a problem." I had a sinking feeling. "What?" "Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in his cell overnight," he said. "Apparently hung himself." I couldn't believe it.
His first reaction, as he recounts in his memoir, was to worry that some people in America might not buy the idea that Jeffrey Epstein had killed himself. Quote,
"No one's going to believe it was a suicide. There'll be conspiracy theories all over the place."
Now that's a pretty odd response if you think about it. At the time, there was no way that Bill Barr could have known for sure how Jeffrey Epstein died. So you would think, as the Attorney General, his first concern would be finding out what actually happened. But instead, his first concern was worry that the public might jump to unapproved conclusions about what happened.
I was appalled, and indeed the whole department was, and frankly, angry, to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. We are now learning of serious irregularities at this facility that are deeply concerning and demand a thorough investigation. The FBI and the Office of Inspector General are doing just that. We will get to the bottom of what happened, and there will be accountability.
But that turned out to be untrue. 3.5 years after Jeffrey Epstein died, no one has gotten to the bottom of what happened that day, and there has been no accountability for it. So once again, 3.5 years after one of the most widely covered deaths of our time, there are still no answers, and there is still no accountability. Why is that? Well, many reasons, probably, but one of them is that Washington veteran Bill Barr, the only man in the modern era to serve as Attorney General twice, declared the Epstein case closed. Now, at first blush, Barr seems to have good reason for doing that.
The initial reports indicated that cameras that would have shown access to Epstein's cell were not operating that night. I could understand why the public would be suspicious of the circumstances, and I, myself, at that stage, did not rule out foul play. I was mortified at the breakdown of the process and that the Bureau of Prisons had failed to secure one of the most important prisoners we had in custody. By the end of 2019, I was confident that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide by hanging himself.
Now, why did Bill Barr believe that? Well, the first piece of evidence he offers up is this, quote,
"The New York City medical examiner had conducted an autopsy and ruled that Epstein killed himself by hanging."
That's the first piece of evidence. The second is this. It's a videotape that, quote, confirmed the medical examiner's findings.
Other evidence also pointed to suicide, but it was the video evidence that confirmed the medical examiner's finding. In the special housing unit where Epstein was held, there is a large open common area where the correctional officers sit at a desk. The desk is at the foot of open stairs leading up to a unit or tier of 8 cells in which Epstein's cell was located. There is only one way into that tier, and hence to Epstein's cell, and that is to go up the stairs and through a gated entryway immediately at the top of the stairs, which is plainly visible from the desk at the foot of the stairs. Epstein's cell, the first inside the entryway, was only about 15 feet from the officer's desk. A video camera inside the unit was not functioning that night, but a separate video camera located in the common area had clear coverage of the officer's desk area, the open stairs, and the gated entryway. I personally reviewed that video footage. It shows conclusively that between the time Epstein was locked in his cell at 7:49 p.m. on the night of August 9 and the time he was discovered the next morning at 6:30 a.m., no one entered his tier.
Therefore, Bill Barr explained, we can know for sure that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. Barr began by claiming that the medical examiner who conducted Epstein's autopsy ruled his death a suicide. But that is not true. The initial cause of death following the autopsy was not suicide, but, quote, pending, which is to say unclear. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy could not say how Jeffrey Epstein died. Forensic pathologist Michael Baden, who was also present that day, came away believing Epstein had been murdered. After reviewing more than 1,000 suicides by hanging in New York State, Baden later said he couldn't find a single neck injury, not one, that matched the injury that Epstein sustained. Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself, Baden concluded. He was strangled. The physical evidence he saw at the autopsy made that obvious.
On day one, there were findings that were unusual for suicidal hanging and more consistent with ligature homicidal strangulation, which included...
And it was suggested at the time that he committed suicide by doing what?
By hanging. At the time he was found allegedly hanging by a homemade ligature of sheets.
Are you saying you don't think it was suicide?
I think that the evidence points toward homicide rather than suicide.
Why?
Because there are multiple 3 fractures in the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, that are very unusual for suicide and more indicative of strangulation, homicidal strangulation.
Let's take a look at what the medical examiner stated. After careful review of all the investigative information, including complete autopsy findings, the determination on the death of Epstein is below. Cause, hanging, manner, suicide.
But New York City's chief medical examiner, Barbara Sampson, who was not present at the autopsy, overruled the judgment of those who were. Days later, on the basis of no new evidence or investigation, Barbara Sampson simply declared Jeffrey Epstein's death a suicide. That was the city's official but totally unsupported conclusion, which Bill Barr and many others promptly repeated. Why did Chief Medical Examiner Barbara Sampson do that? We don't know. We called Sampson today to ask her, but she hung up on us. Then there's the question of the videotape, which Barr cited. Both cameras trained on the door of Jeffrey Epstein's cell did not work that night, famously. And to this day, no one has explained why they didn't work. So the video footage that Bill Barr said he watched didn't cover Epstein's cell, just the entrance to the larger cell block. No one came in or out of the tier, Barr said. Therefore, Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. So let's consider that claim rationally. On the night of August 9th, Jeffrey Epstein was being held in the special housing unit of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, the most secure part of the city's federal lockup. It would be physically impossible for a stranger to get in and out of this facility without an electronic pass and without being seen by the countless cameras in place between the street and the locked 9th floor of the building. So if Jeffrey Epstein was murdered, he was not murdered by an intruder, someone who came into the tier. He was murdered by someone on his own cell block, obviously. There were 7 other cells on Epstein's tier, and each one housed dangerous criminals. So if you were looking for a killer, you would figure out who was in those cells. But no one seems to have thought of that or done it. The Bureau of Prisons refused to provide us with a list of the inmates on Epstein's tier. It's not clear how many of them were even interviewed by investigators, despite the fact that some of them were transferred out of the facility shortly after Epstein's death. That's a baffling oversight. Instead, Attorney General Bill Barr simply assured the country that no one from outside came into Jeffrey Epstein's tier and declared the case solved. And if you think about it, that is a remarkable way to assess a potential crime scene, especially when you consider the source. Bill Barr was not a civilian or a crime novel aficionado. He was the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. He was the nation's top cop. His job was to solve crimes. And yet somehow, with all his law enforcement experience, it never seemed to dawn on Bill Barr that if there was a killer, the killer would have come from one of the cells on Epstein's tier. And then further, apparently, No one in the entire FBI suggested this to Bill Barr as they reviewed the case. Excuse me, Mr. Attorney General. It doesn't matter what the camera outside the tier shows. What matters is what happened inside the tier. Again, obvious.
Federal prosecutors said yesterday video of Epstein's jail cell when he made his first suicide attempt no longer exists. That's a quote. Epstein died by suicide weeks later on August 10th.
A recent 60 Minutes broadcast shows the New York jail cell where Jeffrey Epstein hanged himself last August. But now there's new focus on the suicide attempt Epstein made weeks before he died. Video of the cell exterior where Epstein first tried to end his life was sent to federal investigators and restored last week. But on Thursday, prosecutors said it's the wrong video. In a letter, federal prosecutors said the jail inadvertently preserved video from the wrong tier at the jail. And as a result, video from outside the defendant's cell no longer exists. The missing jail cell video could reignite speculation of a cover-up as the detention facility continues to be under fire for multiple failures before Epstein died in custody.
Why do so many public officials persist in claiming that Jeffrey Epstein attempted suicide in prison once before, on July 23, 2019?
After an initial suicide attempt a little over 2 weeks earlier, Epstein had been put on suicide watch, which meant he was under continuous observation every minute in a special cell.
Now, that's a very convenient claim if you're trying to convince people that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, but there's no evidence that it's true. In fact, Jeffrey Epstein himself adamantly denied ever trying to kill himself, in prison or out. He denied this to his friends, to his lawyers, and to prison psychologists. He said instead that he was injured by another inmate. That's why he was in fetal position on the ground. According to David Schoen, who talked to him shortly after that event, Epstein seemed upbeat, happy, and confident of his release from jail. But he was very concerned about being hurt by someone in a nearby cell.
Nicholas Tartaglione was Epstein's cellmate at the Metropolitan Correctional Center for the weeks between Epstein's July arrest and his first suicide attempt.
One thing that's not mentioned is that during his first, quote, suicide attempt, his cellmate, Nicholas Tartaglione, who was an ex-cop accused of quadruple murder and facing the death penalty, was who he accused of hurting him. He said he wasn't suicidal. Ironically, former FBI Director James Comey's daughter, Maureen Comey, was working as a prosecutor on both cases. And if we fast forward to December 14, 2022, death penalty off the table for former Broadcliff Manor officer facing murder charges. Nicholas Tartaglione is accused of being involved in a high-profile drug conspiracy and quadruple murder. Attorney General Merrick Garland was involved in the decision to not seek the death penalty. Maybe he did something to earn that.
After 6 days, he had been taken off suicide watch on the recommendation of the prison psychiatric team. He was then placed in the special housing unit, which permits closer scrutiny, and was placed on special observation status, the next highest level of monitoring below suicide watch. This required that he be housed in the same cell with a trusted inmate and that he be physically checked by correctional staff every 30 minutes. But these safeguards were not carried out. The day before Epstein's death, his cellmate was transferred to another facility and no new cellmate was assigned. The night of Epstein's death, the correctional officers assigned to the unit failed to conduct any of the required checks and then falsified the records to show they had.
Epstein was discovered the morning of August 10th by a part-time prison guard called Michael Thomas, who amazingly was the very same guard who discovered him in fetal position on the floor after his previous falsely reported suicide attempt. But by the time the EMTs arrived, Epstein's body had been moved to the prison infirmary. That's a clear violation of federal policy. Who ordered that? And though Jeffrey Epstein had been dead for at least 2 hours when the guard found him in his cell, by the time the EMTs arrived, Epstein was clad in a hospital gown. That means that somebody, for some reason, cut away Jeffrey Epstein's prison uniform and redressed his stiffening corpse in new clothes. Why would anyone do that?
Curiosity? People wondering what an egg penis looks like?
Sir, according to the police department's probable cause affidavit, one witness described your penis as oval-shaped and claimed when erect it was thick towards the bottom but was thin and small towards the head portion, and called it egg-shaped. Those are not my words. I apologize.
And then to make it even stranger, Jeffrey Epstein's corpse was intubated. Air was blown into his lifeless lungs. It's not clear why.
So he was in a hospital gown, he had been intubated, and they moved his body? That makes me question even more if he was dead, or maybe replaced with a body.
Now, there was handheld video of all of this happening. That might explain it, but that video has never been released. In fact, authorities will not even acknowledge that it exists, but it does exist. Nor has the EMT's account of what they saw that day, their mandatory so-called pre-hospital care report, ever been released. Nor, most strikingly of all, are there photographs of Jeffrey Epstein dead in his cell. And that means it's impossible to know the position of his body when it was found or how he died. Was Jeffrey Epstein hanging from a bed sheet, as the authorities insist? They say he was strangled by a ligature of his own making. His neck was bloody, but the strip of sheet was not. Or was he killed with the electrical cord from his CPAP machine for sleep apnea? That's what Dr. Bodden concluded, because that would be consistent with his actual injuries at autopsy.
The investigation by the FBI and the Inspector General showed that Epstein's death came after a perfect storm of failures. The prison leadership should not have accepted the recommendation of the psychiatric staff to remove him from suicide watch. The failure to immediately assign a new cellmate to share Epstein's cell was the result of an unintentional oversight. The two correctional officers on duty who were supposed to check on Epstein had spent the night surfing the internet and apparently sleeping much of the time. They were charged with falsifying the records to conceal their goofing off and eventually pled guilty.
The only people ever punished for the grotesque malfeasance surrounding Epstein's death were two low-level guards who fell asleep on duty that night. Both pleaded guilty to falsifying government records. But last year, with no real explanation, an Obama-appointed judge dropped all charges against both of them. One of the guards may still work for the federal government. The only people who liked Jeffrey Epstein were his friends, and some of them are clearly happy he's dead.
A man facing trial for loathsome crimes. He would be under pressure to incriminate others, perhaps some prominent, powerful people.
Here's Bill Gates, whom records show spent quite a bit of time with Jeffrey Epstein after he became a registered sex offender.
What did you do when you found out about his background?
Well, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so, in general, you always have to be careful.
You can imagine that Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew and many, many others feel the same way. No one wants to talk about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein because privately a lot of people are happy about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein.
The fact that so many failures occurred at one time understandably led people to suspect the worst. But thorough investigations have shown once again the wisdom of Hanlon's razor. Don't ascribe malice when stupidity is a sufficient explanation.
Oh, and Bill Barr doesn't mention anything about his father being the headmaster of the Dalton School in the 60s and 70s, and even giving Jeffrey Epstein his first job as a teacher. I guess he forgot. Fucking stoned. I got